Good morning. It's good to be with you this morning. I'm personally greatly glad to be back again with you this week. Last week, Alyssa and I took a little anniversary trip over the weekend, belated anniversary trip, and that was really nice. It's also nice to be back here, be back with you again today, so I'm glad that we're here together this morning. You know, I've really actually experienced a whole wide range of events this week ever since we got back from our trip. It's been big things and it's been small things, but it's just been a whole lot of different things seem to be on my mind and heart. There's, of course, that great relief you feel when you get home from a trip. Even a good trip is just something comforting, relieving about being home again, where all your stuff is, where your dog is, where your bed is. It's nice to be home. Yesterday was my dad's birthday, so I've been feeling happy for my old man. That's what we call him now, old man. You're welcome to call him that too if you want. Yesterday we also had the memorial service for Beth, and that was filled with emotion. Tears were shed, and there was also this great joy at her comfort now that she's with the Lord. Lots of emotions this week. And then there's also been this little nagging knot in my stomach this week. For the past few days, not there all the time, just kind of comes and goes, but there's all of this little tangled up excitement and nervousness about tonight. Tonight is, of course, our annual trunk or treat, and I could not be more excited about that event. It's one of my favorite ones of the year, but I also kind of get a little nervous with these things as well. Can I share that with you? Really, anytime we have these big events, I kind of get this inner feeling, even though I know the plans that have been made to make this a great night for our kids, for our neighborhood. Even though I know all of the people who are ready to serve, and I'm just amazed with how many people are ready to serve tonight, really answered the bell. Even though I know all of the work that has been put into this beforehand, and I've seen it all firsthand, even still, there's just that little nagging feeling in my gut when I think about all of the people who may be coming. On Thursday, I'm writing my sermon, and my mind is wandering to the people who are coming. I'm doing the dishes at night. I'm thinking about the people who are coming because we're about to host this big thing for our friends, for our family, and for neighbors we haven't even met just yet. And we don't know all that it could be, but we do know that people are coming. And that's when it hits me. Could this be a little bit of what the disciples are feeling in our story today from the Gospel of John? Could that be just a little glimpse into what the disciples are going through when Jesus hosts a crowd and teaches his disciples a lesson about mission? So that's what we're going to be talking about today. The story comes from John chapter 6, if you want to get out a Bible and follow along. And we are, of course, continuing this week in our ongoing theme for the month as we think about God's plentiful mission as told through the Gospel of John. And in our chapter today, John chapter 6, Jesus is going to teach his disciples this powerful object lesson about how to respond to his mission, even when many times it might seem a little overwhelming. Let's look at this chapter together. I think we can learn at least 3 things about God and his mission from this chapter here today. John chapter 1 is where we're going to be beginning, if you want to follow along. There we read that after this, Jesus went away to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. And a large crowd was following him because they saw the signs that he was doing for the sick. So Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat down with his disciples, and the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was at hand. Now I want you to really pay attention to these next few verses. Lifting up his eyes then, and seeing that a large crowd was coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat?" Now he said this to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. But Philip answered him the way that I might answer him. He said, 200 denarii worth of bread would not be enough for them to each get a little. 200 days' wages, Jesus. It wouldn't even get us started to feeding a crowd like this. And it's here that I think that Philip may be experiencing that little knot in his stomach. The excitement, the nervousness, because they lift up their eyes, they see the crowd. People are coming. And they, unlike us, have not had time to plan. They have not passed out sign-up sheets and gathered volunteers. They have not done any work to prepare for this great crowd. And yet Jesus, the host, calmly and coolly turns to Philip and he says, "Where should we get some bread for this great crowd?" Can you see why Philip reacts the way that he does? Verse 10, we learn that this crowd is not just any crowd. This is a crowd of about 5,000 men, it tells us. And if there were women and children as well, we don't know how many there were. 5,000 plus, imagine it, are coming to you. And they're not just coming, they're already here. And Philip says in verse 7 what I think roughly translates in Greek to, "You got to be kidding me, Jesus. We can't, there's no way we can do this. We don't have enough for these people. We can't do enough for these people. We don't have enough bread, and we don't even have the money to go and get it for a crowd like this." Philip is feeling overwhelmed. And can you see why? Today I've actually recruited a few helpers to give us a chance to see why. Our two volunteers here, if you'll go ahead and be making your way, this is your cue. Prepared a little object lesson myself for this morning. They're going to go ahead and start bringing in what I have prepared. As we get ready for our trunk or treat tonight, we, unlike Philip, have had a little chance to prepare for what's coming tonight, and it dawned on me on Thursday as I paused my sermon writing and went to go unload a pickup truck full of supplies. It dawned on me that we happen to have a whole lot of bread on hand right now. That's perfect right there. And Dalton, if you could put that one right up next to it there. On these carts, thank you, gentlemen, that my helpers are bringing in, you will see what 960 hot dog buns looks like. Bread for about 1,000 people. And I know that you may not be able to see exactly if you're in the back, so I took a picture here in case you can't see it. This whole cart is loaded up with bread. The original plan was to put it all up on a table like this, but it took too long, and they kept falling off because of those slick plastic wrappers on it. You should have seen it. It was a real comedy show, putting all that bread together. So we used the carts instead. And I wanted you to see how much bread this is. We may not need all of this bread for tonight. I don't know. We just want to be ready. But maybe it helps us to picture a little bit of what Philip is feeling, because Philip would need 5 times as much as this just to almost have enough for all the men who come, not to mention the women and children who might be there also, and not to mention the fact that this would just be enough to give everybody a bite or two, much less to fill the stomachs of everyone who is gathered before Jesus. This is 1/5 of giving a little. And that's why Philip is saying, you got to be kidding me. We don't have enough. We can't do enough. But Jesus, according to verse 6, had asked him this question to test him. Much like God had done with his people on the Exodus journey, Jesus is teaching his followers here this elaborate object lesson, a lesson that applies to their attitude, a lesson that relates to their mission. Deuteronomy chapter 8 tells the Exodus story, or part of it, and it tells us that in the wilderness, the Lord your God has led you these 40 years, testing you to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not. And he humbled you and let you hunger. They did not have enough bread, but God fed you with manna, which you did not know, that he might make you know that man does not live by bread alone, but man lives by every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. And guess what? Your clothing when you were in the wilderness, it did not wear out, and your feet did not swell those 40 years. For the Lord your God is bringing you into a good land, a land of wheat and barley, a land in which you will eat bread without scarcity, a land in which you will lack nothing. And you shall eat and be full, and you shall bless the Lord your God for the good land that he has given you. You see, when God was testing his people in the wilderness, he was teaching them a lesson. They were crying out, like Philip was crying out, we don't have enough. We don't have what we need. But God showed them what they did have. A God who could rain bread from the clouds if he wanted to. A God who would keep their clothing from wearing out as long as they needed it. A God who, even when it seemed like they had so little to give, had already given them what they truly needed. Every word which proceeds from the mouth of God. And here in John 6, just like in the wilderness, Philip is going to cry out and say, we don't have enough. We can't do enough. But Jesus changes the question, doesn't he? That's what we're about to see. And it's our first lesson about mission this morning. It's that in this story, Jesus is less concerned with what we don't have, with what we can't do. Jesus is far more concerned with what we do have. And if the answer is we have the Lord, and every word which proceeds from the mouth of God, then we have what we need in abundance. So, verse 8, one of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to Jesus, well, there is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are they for so many? There's a fellow here who has 1 package of hot dog buns. They read their bulletin. But what would that do for a crowd like this? I don't really see this as a great declaration of faith, but maybe it's a start. Andrew's starting to think less about what we don't have. He's starting to ask the question, what do we have? And Jesus is about to show him what God can do with what they have. Verse 10. So Jesus said, have the people sit down. There was much grass in that place, so the men sat down, about 5,000 in number. And Jesus then took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, and catch that, as much as they wanted. And when they had eaten their fill, because they did eat their fill, he told his disciples, gather up the leftover fragments so that nothing may be lost. You see, when Jesus' disciples stop thinking about what they don't have or what they can't do, and they start instead to ask, what do we have? And they turn it over to the Lord. What they have, even though it may seem to be so little, God does more with that little offering than they could have ever dreamed, than they could have ever imagined. You remember how the promised land was described in Deuteronomy chapter 8 as a land of barley and wheat in which you will lack nothing, eat and be full, and bless the Lord your God. Jesus brings a taste of the promised land to the crowd in the desert. And all he needs is 5 loaves. All he needs is 2 fish. And it all starts with that change of perspective. Not what you don't have. What do you have? And if the answer is the Lord, what can he do with what we have to give? Once they start changing their perspective, it leads to another big change in perspective. This miracle, began with simple bread, simple fish, just some of the ordinary things of life. But of course, Jesus has in mind so much more than just bread. In Jesus' hands, Jerry, I'm going to go to this one here and turn. In Jesus' hands, that simple offering of fish and that simple offering of bread becomes the opportunity to point to something so much greater than that, so much more significant and everlasting than a simple meal, points to something spiritual. So Jesus is going to go on in John 6 to say to that crowd, "Truly I say to you, you're seeking me because you ate your fill of the loaves." All of this started with the simple bread that Jesus multiplied and gave to the crowd. But what you really need to see, Jesus says, is that I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me shall never hunger, and whoever believes in me shall never thirst. And by the way, it wasn't really Moses who gave you the bread from heaven. It was my Father who gave you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is he who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. Do you see the way that it was never really just about bread for Jesus? And in much the same way, our mission may involve many tangible things, but it's never just about those things. When we collect money in a plate, it's not just about the number we post on the bulletin board, is it? And when we give school supplies to the children down the street, it's really not just about pencils and paper. And when we cook hot dogs and give out candy tonight, it's not just a fun night with free sweets and treats. I know that many, many people may walk away from those things and really only take from it a fun night of free sweets and treats or some pencils and paper. Kind of like I know that many, many people walk away from a miracle of Jesus, and all they really take from it is the bread he gave them to eat. Even Jesus deals with this. At the end of the story, Jesus is going to say, as he watches everybody walk away from him, he's going to say to his 12, "Are you going to walk away too?" Jesus knows that many, many people don't get it. But there's something that still makes it worth it for Jesus to break that bread and share it, to take that simple offering and use it to say something more. I am the bread of life who gives life to the world. And when Jesus takes those simple things and he shares them for something more, he's giving the real message that's worth sharing. The motivation is worth the effort. And then there's one last thing that Christ does in this story that I want to point out. When all the food has been shared and everybody's had as much as they wanted and they're satisfied, Jesus turns to his disciples. He does one more thing. You know what he does? He turns to his disciples. You know this. He says, "Gather up the leftover fragments so that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up. They filled 12 baskets with the fragments from the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten. 12 baskets for 12 disciples. You know, I've always kind of wondered about what's going on with these 12 baskets full and what Jesus is really trying to say. Maybe some of you have some theories as well. Part of me wonders, could Jesus be as much of a fan of leftovers as I am? But I don't think that's probably it. To my knowledge, he doesn't have a refrigerator, and if you could make all this food out of 5 loaves, I don't really think you need a to-go box. So it's probably not that. Maybe Jesus is just saying, I told you so to his disciples. Testing you, you doubted me, see what I can do, believe me next time. Maybe that's it. But it doesn't seem like the only motivation. Maybe God is just showing with this abundance how powerful he is, how generous he is. He doesn't just squeak by. He gives more than they need. He gives in abundance. Certainly it does that. But maybe one more thing as well. Something I hadn't considered till recently. If this bread in the story represents something more than just bread, Jesus, the bread of life, could it be that the leftovers in this story represent more than just leftover pieces and crumbs? I think if we look carefully at what Jesus says next, we see exactly that. More than just leftovers. This act of gathering up the broken pieces is the disciples acting out the mission of Jesus. Because in the same breath that Jesus said, I am the bread of life, he talked about his mission. And this is how he described his mission. For I have come down from heaven, not to do my own will, but the will of him who sent me. And what is that will? What is that mission? This is the will of him who sent me, that I should lose nothing of all that he has given me, but raise it up on the last day. 4 verse 37, whoever comes to me, I will never cast out. You see, Christ's mission is a mission of not giving up. It's a mission of gathering up the broken and leaving no one behind who would come to him, so that nothing of all that God has given me should be lost. And then Jesus gives a basket to each one of the 12. And what does he tell them to do? But to gather up the leftovers so that nothing may be lost. It's more than leftovers. This is the mission. It's more than just leftover pieces. This is the calling of God for his disciples. Take up your basket and gather so that nothing may be lost. Because God has forever changed the question. It's not about what we can't do, and it's not about what we don't have. It's about asking, what do we have and what can we give, and what could God do with those simple offerings when in his mighty hands? And if we will go forth with this mission in heart, take up our baskets and gather, maybe God can do great things through us so that nothing may be lost. Maybe you're challenged by that. I hope we're all challenged today and every day. Take up our baskets and remember the mission that Christ has placed in our hands. Maybe there's someone here today who's thinking about what Christ has said here this morning about how he is the bread that gives life to the world. Maybe you're ready to respond to that hope, the hope of everlasting life that we find in him when we die to ourselves and we're buried in baptism and raised up again in him. However you may be called or challenged, we give this moment to respond while we stand, while we sing.